Hello, welcome to Issues and Ideas. I'm Chris DeBello. Did you catch the Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Machado coming to the White House this past week? And to the surprise of, well, nobody, handed over her Nobel Peace Prize, gave it to Trump. Which, by the way, if you look really close on the edge of the medal, non-transferable. So, sorry, it doesn't work that way. Nice little trophy for the trophy case, but it is, for all intents and purposes now, a meaningless trophy. And, of course, Machado's motivation for all this was to win Trump's favor because she wants to be the leader of Venezuela. She won the election that she ran in, but Maduro did what he does best, what any dictator does best, block a legitimate win from a legitimate candidate so they could stay in power. So Machado thought this would be the way to win over Trump and get what she is hoping for and looking for. So let's do a little compare and contrast, shall we not? We have the opposition leader of Venezuela, Maria Machado, basically re-gifting the Nobel Peace Prize to Trump. Then we have Delcy Rodriguez, who was Maduro's vice president and is now leading Venezuela. What can she give Trump? Oil. Gee, I wonder who's going to win this race to Trump's heart. The discussion, debates, social media back and forth about the shooting death by an ICE officer of Renee Nicole Good have gone in quite a few directions, have they not? And that's because people are looking at the tragedy through politics, for example, judgment, certainly emotions. Ultimately, it's only the law and the courts that will determine facts, guilt, and innocence. Our first guest today joins us to examine the laws which will have the final say on what transpired along with the aftermath. He's a law professor at the University of Minnesota, Professor Emmanuel Mauleon. How are you today, Professor?
I'm doing all right. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for being here to clarify again, when we have the law and a legal system in place, when emotion overtakes things, then that's the intent of the law sort of gets lost. By the way, to learn more about the University of Minnesota is umn.edu. I want to start with a very brief reading of the Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, because that seems to be, at least at this stage, the foundation of where things are going to progress legally. And the Fourth Amendment, for you listening, reads, "The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and efforts against unreasonable," that's a key word, "searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized." Again, a short collection of words. What's the significance in this case of the shooting that's taken place and the death of Renee Nicole Good?
Sure. Well, as you mentioned, the Fourth Amendment protects and in fact uses the word secures the people against the government from unreasonable searches and seizures. Here, the critical term is a seizure. The use of deadly force against a person has been classified as a seizure by the Supreme Court. And so any use of force, whether it be deadly, whether it be the application of handcuffs or anything in between, must be reasonable under the Fourth Amendment. And this is determined not only based on the evidentiary burden for a particular interaction, whether that be reasonable suspicion or probable cause, but also the degree of force necessary to effectuate compliance for a specific act. This has been outlined by the Supreme Court as dealing with many different factors. So, for example, the severity of the crime at issue, whether a person is armed and dangerous, whether there is an imminent threat of serious bodily harm or injury to an officer or others, and things of that nature, including whether the person is fleeing or evading arrest. And so if this case becomes prosecuted and goes to trial, and that's a very big if at this point, that is the standard under which the decision to shoot and kill Renee Good would be evaluated.
I was looking at the federal laws that specifically the federal agents have to operate under in sections that detail use of force, and they're a bit lengthy, but just to paraphrase here, basically if you're threatened as a federal agent, you have the right to respond to stop the threat. But again, superficially watching the video, I don't have the high-tech equipment to analyze the video. What if what happened was a result of you placing yourself in that threatening position? Does that still apply?
Right. Well, this becomes complicated, and it becomes the complicated factual question. Certainly, it lessens your ability to claim that the use of force was necessary if you put yourself into that position. We have to recall, however, that officers, whether they be municipal, state, or federal law enforcement, have different restrictions on their abilities to use force than the rest of us. So for the rest of us, for example, if we engaged in the type of killing that we saw on the video, we'd have less recourse available. We'd have to claim self-defense. You'd have to meet the elements of self-defense. At least in Minnesota, one of those elements is that you are not the aggressor, that you're not initiating contact. Another element is that you attempt to evade before using deadly force. Both of those things would seem to suggest that this was, wouldn't fall under Minnesota self-defense. But like I said, we don't expect officers to have a duty to run, a duty to flee. They don't have that under the Fourth Amendment. And we also, the courts have been fairly deferential for officers when they claim that they are in danger, even if they've put themselves in that precarious position. Courts tend to not want to second guess the split-second decisions of individual officers in the field. And so, although the standard is, what would an objectively reasonable officer do in this circumstance, and was the force reasonable under that method, courts are really loath to second-guess the rapid decision-making of an officer. That's all to say that the standard is incredibly deferential to officers. It's incredibly difficult to prosecute and convict under these cases. And even still, I think that this case is one in which it's not entirely clear which way, a court of law or a jury would go. And I think that tells you something about perhaps the egregious nature of this case, and certainly the value of having video evidence to evaluate it versus the statement of just the law enforcement officers on the scene.
Professor Emmanuel Mauleon, who is a law professor at the University of Minnesota, umn.edu, the website, and you are listening to Issues and Ideas. Hasn't the Supreme Court ruled that you can't look at one specific point of time within the event? You have to look at the event, the action, the reaction. You have to look at the totality of what happened. Is that correct?
That's correct. And so the totality of the circumstances includes, like you said, all of the factual information. It includes the severity of the crime. It includes if the officer, if an objectively reasonable officer would believe that they were in imminent threat of serious bodily harm, them or somebody else, and also if the suspect was fleeing. All of these things create the totality of the circumstances. The totality of the circumstances is just to suggest that there's not one determinant factor that is going to tip the scale one way or the other. You have to balance the inquiry overall. And so you're correct. You have to look at who initiated, what was going on. Was Miss Good posing a threat before the shooting? Was she being, pursued for a crime? Whereas the Supreme Court case, Tennessee v. Gardner, which sets out the standard for use of force against somebody that's fleeing, and it suggests that you can't use deadly force on someone that's fleeing unless they're posing an imminent threat. That was still a case where somebody committed a serious crime. Courts are going to be less deferential when the officers are initiating contact where there's not evidence of a crime. Now, of course, the federal officers and DHS have indicated that they do believe a crime was underway. In fact, they suggest that there was domestic terrorism, which I think is hard to suggest, at least from my evaluation. But they suggest that a crime was underway in impeding immigration officers from performing their federal duties, which is itself a crime. So, again, it would be, there are complicated constitutional questions here, complicated factual questions, but certainly I think from the video and everything we've seen reported, there would be enough to bring charges, so long as there was access to the evidence.
And looking at the totality, that would bring into play, too, what turned out to be Ms. Good's final words. "We're okay, dude. I'm not mad at you." And she was smiling at the guy.
Yeah, certainly that's something that a jury would be able to evaluate in that totality.
Another word that comes into play through the Fourth Amendment, as far as what we've been hearing in the debate, and it comes into play, too, with the various laws that we're referencing here, the concept of a reasonable. I saw where back in May of last year, Supreme Court did issue a decision in the case Barnes v. Felix, because I guess the lower courts, there wasn't any kind of consistency in what was being ruled as reasonable and unreasonable. Did that ruling in Barnes v. Felix by the Supreme Court help solidify and even better educate so that law enforcement can go back and restudy what their training, what their rules are, to make sure that there's a full understanding of reasonable versus unreasonable?
Well, I would say that there tends to be a disconnect between how the court conceptualizes of putting officers on notice about what is reasonable or unreasonable conduct, and what actually occurs in the field with training. So there's some ways in which the court will say, an officer was not on notice that conducting, shooting into a vehicle in this manner would have been a constitutional violation, would have been unreasonable. And the court can say it is unreasonable, but because under the doctrine of qualified immunity, because they weren't on fair notice, essentially, then they're entitled to immunity from a civil suit. One of the things that structure would seem to suggest is that officers are apprised of developments in constitutional law as it develops and have continuous training on the use of force. But something a former colleague of mine, Joanna Schwartz, has shown to a great extent is that feedback loop simply doesn't exist. Officers tend to get their initial training at the academy, which distills some use of force general principles, but they certainly aren't apprised. They're not lawyers, and their job is not meant to be lawyers and to, the ins and outs of all of the constitutional law developing around the use of force. So to the extent that that is stated as a reason why officers should be off the hook, it suggests that there's a feedback loop that isn't actually implemented into their training and knowledge of the law.
And even when there is training, because we're seeing the training for ICE agents has been reduced from 6 months to, it's an odd number, I know, but it's 47 days, and that number wasn't picked arbitrarily. Someone within the decision process picked that number because Donald Trump is the 47th president, so that gives you kind of a clue what we're working with here. A lot still to be determined, a lot still to be discovered, a lot still to be adjudicated, and that's the key word. And it's not trial by social media, it's trial by court and law. And I think that's the important part to remember in all this. We've been joined by a law professor at the University of Minnesota, their website, umn.edu, Professor Emmanuel Mauleon. Professor, thank you for the education. Help us better understand how we need to prioritize law over emotion. Certainly have sympathy, empathy, anger, that we're human beings, that we can't help. But we have to put the law on top first because that's what we're built on in this country. Thanks for being here today.
All right. Thank you so much.
Articles of impeachment have been filed in the House of Representatives by Democrat Representative Robin Kelly of Illinois. No, not against Donald Trump. This impeachment motion is against Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem. Yeah, they can do that. The impeachment process isn't an exclusive for just the president. My next guest joins us to explain the impeachment process, whether it differs based upon who it's being applied to, and how federal government-level impeachments have unfolded throughout history. He is a former senior reporter for Time magazine, professor emeritus of political science at St. Peter's University, that's in Jersey City, New Jersey. Professor Alain Sanders, how are you today, Professor?
Very good, Chris. How are you?
Great to have you back here to talk about this and learn more about the educational opportunities at St. Peter's. It is stpeters.edu. Let's start with the foundation, then we'll do the exploration. How does the U.S. Constitution provide the guidance, the direction, and the limitations when it comes to impeachment?
Well, it basically, gives general guidelines, very general guidelines. So there's a lot of room for development of rules and standards and norms for each House of Congress. But basically, the basic outline is that the House of Representatives impeaches, and that simply means makes an accusation, brings charges. That's what impeachment technically means in this process. So the House impeaches, but in order to remove the official from office, the Senate must try the charges that the House has drawn up, and then, of course, it must vote to convict. That's the general process. of the system. The House impeaches, accuses, basically. The Senate tries and convicts. And the conviction only means that the official is removed from office and can no longer hold any federal office in the future.
You know, when you think about this, the framers of the Constitution, they had great forward vision to know that this could be the one of the zip ties, I guess we'll call it, that could keep the structure of a republic together.
Well, that's right. I mean, they understood that malfeasance in power can occur, and certainly they had plenty of experience about that with King George, and so they believed that there should be a system to remove officers from high places. So the impeachment clause applies to both, certainly the president. We've seen that recently with the two impeachments of President Trump. But impeachment also applies to high officers of the land, cabinet officers, for instance, and to all the federal judges in the federal system. So basically, it applies to all three branches of government.
And if you look at the list of those who were at least impeached or the motions were launched against them, it's a sizable list, and it's not occupied heavily by presidents, sitting or otherwise. And here's your little history lesson for the morning. The first person where impeachment was tried against was William Blount, senator from Tennessee, in 1797, and the charges were dismissed for want of jurisdiction. Blount had been expelled from the U.S. Senate before his trial, so that sort of became a moot point at that point. But as far as impeachment goes, as you said, it's the charges are levied in the House, the trial is done in the Senate. When, and it's more often than not, by far, when the Senate says not guilty, does that charge of impeachment carry any weight, any significance, or is it does it go back to just being a word and an action once again?
Nothing happens. It's just like any acquittal. Impeachment is not exactly a criminal process, but it parallels the kinds of things that you expect to see in a criminal process. So there's the trial in the Senate, and then if there's an acquittal, that is to say, if the Senate votes not to convict, then the official remains in power, and there's no liabilities or problems or issues associated with it. It's simply an acquittal.
So when we say, for example, I'll put it in more contemporary terms, when we say Donald Trump is a twice impeached U.S. president, that really is meaningless when you think about it.
Well, it's meaningless in the sense that there are no consequences. No consequences follow, but certainly is a stain on the reputation of the politician, anybody who's been impeached, because it means that a majority of the House has found that there is wrongdoing. I mean, they're accusing the person of wrongdoing. So it carries a political stain, if you will, next to the person's name. But in terms of consequences, real-life consequences to that person, there are none. And we see that since President Trump was twice impeached during his first term, and he went on to win re-election for a second time to the office with no consequences flowing from the impeachment process.
Although since politicians are so eager to protect and even construct and guide their legacy, if the impeachment tag is attached to them and the biographer is writing their story, well, if they're a legitimate biographer, they're going to be compelled to tell the story of what was behind that impeachment. So there goes a clean and pure legacy, at least.
That's right. And it goes to show that the whole impeachment process is a political process. That is to say, the politics of the day influence the accusation, and of course they influence the acquittal. But it means that any historian, any person wanting to look at what happened during this particular period of impeachment, will look at the charges, will look at the charges and make his or her own judgment about the validity of those charges, regardless of how the political system ultimately dealt with them.
I know, looking through the timeline of impeachments, the only time they actually did succeed were with federal judges, which ranged from being drunk on the bench to being biased in trials. It's, unless I'm missing something, and for you listening, it is a rather lengthy list. I mean, you'll see some names you might recognize if you're a moderate fan of history: Samuel Chase, Andrew Johnson, among others. But as far as I could see, Professor, it was just the judges that saw the system and the process go completely against them.
Yeah, that's right. And, of course, the actual convictions are very few in number, even for judges. But it's not surprising because really, when you take a look at it, we've had experience with the Trump impeachments and the Clinton impeachments. You're dealing with a political situation when you're accusing a president or when you're accusing a cabinet officer, and so party politics very much becomes involved. When you're dealing with a judge, typically judges are nonpartisan, and that when they're accused of wrongdoing, it's usually something very specific that parallels a violation of some criminal law. And so because judges are nonpartisan, partisan politics in the accusation and in the conviction plays less of a role. And so that's why you're seeing those accusations, those impeachments, to be greater in number for the judiciary. And, of course, the convicted folks have only been judges.
Talking with Professor Alain Sanders, former Time Magazine senior reporter, Professor Emeritus of Political Science at St. Peter's University. It's in Jersey City. Their website, stpeters.edu, and you are listening to Issues and Ideas. We've seen this impeachment attempt of Kristi Noem grow rather rapidly. Last time I looked, it was around 70 co-sponsors of the bill, obviously far short of what's going to be needed to progress into a vote and then to have the trial in the House. But you mentioned this before. Has the impeachment process, because of it being a more political tool than a keeping things right tool, has it diminished, has it become tarnished?
Well, it's become tarnished in the sense that, it doesn't really work because of the partisan politics that get involved in the process, rather than being sort of an objective process where you look at the wrongdoing of the officer. Really, it boils down to a political game between the parties. And so in terms of its efficacy in removing officers who engage in malfeasance, it doesn't really function. But it does function as part of the political process. So if an officer is impeached, voters get a chance to, of course, hear the accusations and the evidence that backs up the accusations, and it becomes part of the electoral landscape. And so that's why it's become a political thing rather than really a more judicial or judicious kind of process. So the movement to impeach Kristi Noem is clearly political. The Democrats who are lining up to back the articles of impeachment are attacking her policies as head of the Department of Interior, of the DHS, I should say, of Homeland Security. They're attacking her policies, and they're using the impeachment process to bring forth evidence that show that she's misused the process, and that's what they hope to do if, of course, they can get a majority of the House to vote for impeachment.
Is this the consequence? I mean, I praise the framers of the Constitution for thinking of this concept and putting this process into the U.S. Constitution, but a lot of people look at the wording of Article 2, Section 4, with the removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery. That's pretty definite. Other high crimes and misdemeanors. That sounds too general for a lot of people, and that's how I think the process is getting twisted to say, well, what you're charging, that really isn't that serious. It's not a high crime. It's not a misdemeanor. Well, first of all, misdemeanor is not a serious crime to begin with. But is that where people are mistaken? Because I've talked with historians, and they said if you look at the notes that the framers kept, and they kept a ton of notes at the Constitutional Convention, through the reading of those notes, you understand what they meant by high crimes and misdemeanors.
Well, you certainly look at what they intended by the words and the speeches and the records of the framers. But if you just look at the plain words, high crimes and misdemeanors, it suggests that you look at everything. It could be a real crime, or it could be a misdemeanor. And a misdemeanor doesn't have to be criminal. It can simply be malfeasance. You can certainly interpret the word that way. So it seems to me that the framers were looking at a malfeasance in office, which could involve an actual crime, or it could simply involve a misuse of power, because they believed that really everybody should be held accountable. They knew how kings in England abused their powers, and they also knew that under the rules of Great Britain, of England, kings could not be accused of crimes because that just wasn't allowed. So they drafted a clause here that said, okay, if there is a demonstrated crime, that person can be accused and tried in the Senate. But if it's just a misdemeanor, a simple malfeasance in office, that would suffice as well. They really wanted to keep officers of the land in check, and they devised a process to do that through checks and balances, but also through a process to remove them from office as well.
Really, it's amazing for you listening to, again, to reiterate, I think the important lesson that we get from this, no matter what or where this impeachment attempt against Kristi Noem winds up going or landing, that the framers thought far enough ahead and could see what would be potential, what would be possible, and put in safeguards to make sure that didn't happen. And again, it's a lengthy list, but when you have a little time, do a search of federal employees, federal positions impeached, or words to that effect, and you're going to see quite a lengthy list of interesting reasons as well for the impeachment. So that'll give you a little homework in your next time it snows and you're stuck inside or something. Learn more about the education opportunities at St. Peter's University in Jersey City, stpeters.edu. He is their Professor Emeritus of Political Science. Professor Alain Sanders, thank you so much for the constitutional education today, sir. Always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure for me, too. Take care, Chris.
Monday is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Dr. King's actual birthday, by the way, was this past Thursday, January 15th. But Monday is what we go with as far as the calendar is concerned. Well, it's easy to say that Dr. King was a man of God. Thought it would be helpful if we explored more specifically how Dr. King lived God's Word and how those ways added to the teaching Dr. King provided us with. I do this with two goals in mind, pretty much. First, it's to honor what Dr. King accomplished, but I also hope that you'll see how you can continue the work that Dr. King started. So let's start with the most obvious. Dr. King brought God's Word into the world for all to hear. Started preaching from a pulpit to a few, and that progressed to preaching to the masses via a worldwide stage. This is how Dr. King lived up to what Jesus instructs in Mark chapter 16, verses 15 and 16. And he, Jesus, said to them, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. He who believes and is baptized will be saved, but he who does not believe will be condemned." We also received this direction from Jesus in Matthew chapter 10, verse 27. "Whatever I tell you in the dark, speak in the light, and what you hear in the ear, preach on the rooftops." Dr. King sought to lift up others, not selectively either. All were invited into God's Word to learn and serve the Lord, as Dr. King did. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 29 explains it this way: "Let no corrupt word proceed out of your mouth, but what is good for necessary edification, that it may impart grace to the hearers." Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a man of peace and peaceful resistance. During the fight for civil rights and equality, there were basically two camps. One led by Dr. King, which was active in nonviolent protests, while the other camp, led by Malcolm X, sought and demanded civil rights and equality by any means necessary. Jesus shined his light on the peacemakers in Beatitudes. Here's what he says in Matthew chapter 5, verse 9. "Blessed are the peacemakers, for these shall be called sons of God." Romans chapter 2, verses 5 and 6 tells those who want to walk and act in anger and with violence what awaits them. "But in accordance with your hardness and your impertinent heart, you are treasuring up for yourself wrath in the day of wrath and revelation of the righteous judgment of God, who will render to each one according to his deeds." Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. shined the brightest light that he could on the darkness that too many used to try to hide injustice, prejudice, and hate with. That darkness discouraged really too many from speaking out due to, fear. Dr. King spoke out against what was wrong and called for what was right and righteous. That brings forward what Jesus speaks about in John chapter 7, verse 24. "Do not judge according to appearance, but judge with righteous judgment." Dr. King's efforts, to put it mildly, were not popular nor embraced by many people. Dr. King was confronted with hate via words, threats, vandalism, physical attacks, which included being stabbed in 1958 in the first attempt to assassinate him. Yet Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., he pressed on. Why? Because Dr. King knew the truth of God, which we're told in Romans chapter 5, verses 3 and 4. And not only that, but we also glory in tribulations, knowing that tribulation produces perseverance, and perseverance character, and character hope. Now, while it's important to endure, more is required of us, children of God. Those who hate the righteous will not go away if we simply just stand still and tolerate them. Sort of like tolerating the school bully who wants to steal your lunch money. You just tolerate them and they'll come back tomorrow and once again steal your lunch money. What's the additional action needed that Dr. King lived and demonstrated? The answer comes to us in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 13. Therefore, take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand. You can read verses 14 through 18 for the details, but briefly, Paul is writing about truth, righteousness, peace, and faith, among other characteristics and qualities. From all that I've placed before you about the life and work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., are you thinking, no way, how can I measure up to all of that? Or how can I be worthy to take the baton and run forward with it? Let me take you to the very root and foundation for everything I just shared about the life and the work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and how if you're a devoted child of God, that foundation exists in your very soul. And that foundation is described with one single syllable word: faith. We have what Paul writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 5, that your faith should not be in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. And we're also told this in Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 and 6, trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths. If you're still trying to sell yourself short and doubt your ability to bring and live God's word into this world, believing that you can't measure up to what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. accomplished, let me remind you about something. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was not a perfect person. No one is. Romans chapter 3, verse 23 establishes that truth clearly, saying, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." But Romans chapter 3, verse 24 takes us to the empowerment God blesses those who walk in faith with, being justified freely by his grace through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus. As I mentioned, this Monday is Martin Luther King Jr. Day, as has become a tradition here on Issues and Ideas. We're about to listen to one of Dr. King's speeches. Why do I do this? Why go back to words of yesterday? Do they still apply today? Well, I'll let you be the judge of that, but first, a refresher. The Civil Rights Act made it illegal to deny someone a job or education opportunity because of their race or color, religion, sex, national origin. For decades, it's been used to fight discrimination against groups who were denied basic rights, especially black Americans and other people of color. I put that reminder out to you because here's what someone of note, we'll call them, had to say about the Civil Rights Act this past Wednesday in an interview with the New York Times, quoting here, "Well, I think a lot of people were very badly treated. When people were very badly treated, where they did extremely well and they were not invited to go into a university or a college. So I would say in that way, I think it was unfair in certain cases. And I think it was also at the same time, it accomplished some very wonderful things, but it also hurt a lot of people that deserved to go to college or deserved to get a job or were unable to get a job. So it was a reverse discrimination." Talking about the Civil Rights Act. Now, who was the person of note who knowingly, openly, and freely said that on the record in an interview with the New York Times this past Wednesday? Donald Trump. It's certainly poisonous when an everyday person spews that ignorance, but when it's someone who's at the level that Trump is at, it's not only toxic, it also encourages the bigoted to feel justified. No other way to put it. Found this report. It's called the 2025 Blackout Report. It's by a nonprofit organization, Onyx Impact. And here are some of the details from the report. 15,723 distinct impact points, each one an instance in which black opportunities, lives, or histories have been directly attacked since the Trump administration regained power in January 2025. The report found, among other things, 6,769 federal data sets at agencies ranging from the CDC and the FDA to the U.S. Justice Department have been erased. More than 591 black books were banned just in 2025 across 6 states. More than $3.4 billion in federal grants were either cut or frozen for programs that increased health, education, and opportunities for the nation's black Americans. So with all that, do you still think the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. are long past their expiration date? Speech by Dr. King that I've selected is entitled The Other America. Dr. King delivered it on April 14, 1967 at Stanford University. Now, the entire speech is 46 minutes. So with the time restraints we have, won't be able to listen to the entire speech right now. We have posted a video of Dr. King delivering the full speech, The Other America, on our website homepage. That being said, I believe the part we're going to listen to will strongly reveal just how desperately we need to hear yesterday's words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. today.
In the Negro community, that is a major, tragic, and staggering depression that we face in our everyday lives. Now, the other thing that we've got to come to see now that many of us didn't see too well during the last 10 years, and that is that racism is still alive in American society and much more widespread than we realize. And we must see racism for what it is. It is a myth of the superior and the inferior race. It is the false and tragic notion that one particular group, one particular race is responsible for all of the progress, all of the insights, and the total flow of history. And the theory that another group or another race is totally depraved, innately impure, and innately inferior. And in the final analysis, racism is evil because its ultimate logic is genocide. Hitler was a sick and tragic man who carried racism to its logical conclusion. And he ended up leading a nation to the point of killing about 6 million Jews. And this is the tragedy of racism because its ultimate logic is genocide. If one says that I am not good enough to live next door to him, if one says that I am not good enough to eat at a lunch counter, or to have a good, decent job, or to go to school with him merely because of my race, he is saying consciously or unconsciously that I do not deserve to exist. To use a philosophical analogy here, racism is not based on some empirical generalization. It is based rather on an ontological affirmation. It is not the assertion that certain people are behind culturally or otherwise because of environmental conditions. It is the affirmation that the very being of a people is inferior. And this is the great tragedy of it. Now, I say that however unpleasant it is, we must honestly see and admit that racism is still deeply rooted all over America. It's still deeply rooted in the North, and it's still deeply rooted in the South. Now, this leads me to say something about another discussion that we hear a great deal, and that is the so-called white backlash. And I would like to honestly say to you that the white backlash is merely a new name for an old phenomenon. It's not something that just came into being because shouts of black power, or because Negroes engaged in riots in Watts, for instance. The fact is that the state of California voted a fair housing bill out of existence before anybody shouted black power, or before anybody rioted in Watts. It may well be that shouts of black power and riots in Watts and the Harlems and the other areas are the consequences of the white backlash rather than the cause of them. What it is necessary to see is that there has never been a single solid, monistic, determined commitment on the part of the vast majority of white Americans. The whole question of civil rights and on the whole question of racial equality. This is something that truth impels all men of goodwill to admit. It is said on the Statue of Liberty that America is the home of exiles. But it doesn't take us long to realize that America has been the home of its white exiles from Europe. But it has not evinced the same kind of maternal care and concern for its black exiles from Africa. And it is no wonder that in one of his sorrow songs, a Negro could sing out, "Sometimes I feel like a motherless child." What great estrangement, what great sense of rejection caused the people to emerge with such a metaphor as they looked over their lives. What I'm trying to get across is that our nation has constantly taken a positive step forward on the question of racial justice and racial equality. But over and over again at the same time, it made certain backward steps. And this has been the persistence of the so-called white backlash. In 1863, the Negro was freed from the bondage of physical slavery. But at the same time, the nation refused to give him land to make that freedom meaningful. And at that same period, America was giving millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that America was willing to undergird its white peasants from Europe with an economic floor that would make it possible to grow and develop, and refused to give that economic floor to its black peasants, so to speak. And this is why Frederick Douglass could say that emancipation for the Negro was freedom to hunger, freedom to the winds and rains of heaven, freedom without roofs to cover their heads. He went on to say that it was freedom without bread to eat, freedom without land to cultivate. And I submit this afternoon that we can end poverty in the United States. Our nation has the resources to do it. The national gross product of America will rise to the astounding figure of some $7 this year. We have the resources. The question is whether the nation has the will. And I submit that if we can spend $5 billion a year to fight an ill-considered war in Vietnam and $20 billion to put a man on the moon, our nation can spend billions of dollars on their own 2 feet right here on earth. Let me say another thing that's more in the realm of the spirit, I guess. And that is, if we are to go on in the days ahead and make true brotherhood a reality, it is necessary for us to realize more than ever before that the destinies of the Negro and the white man are tied together. Now, there's still a lot of people who don't realize this. The racists still don't realize this. But it is a fact now that Negroes and whites are tied together, and we need each other. The Negro needs the white man to save him from his fear. The white man needs the Negro to save him from his guilt. We are tied together in so many ways: our language, our music, our cultural patterns, our material prosperity, and even our food are an amalgam of black and white. And so there can be no separate black path to power and fulfillment that does not intersect white roots. And there can be no separate white path to power and fulfillment short of social disaster. It does not recognize the need of sharing that power with black aspirations for freedom and justice. We must come to see now that integration is not merely a romantic or aesthetic something where you merely add color to a still predominantly white power structure. Integration must be seen also on political terms, where there is shared power and where black men and white men share power together to build a new and a great nation. In a real sense, we're all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. John Donne placed it years ago in graphic terms: no man is an island entire itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. And he goes on toward the end to say, any man's death diminishes me because I'm involved in mankind. Therefore never sin to know for whom the bell tolls. It tolls for thee. And so we all in the same situation. The salvation of the Negro will mean the salvation of the white man, and the destruction, the life, and of the ongoing progress of the Negro will be the destruction of the ongoing progress of the nation. Now let me say finally that we have difficult days ahead, but I haven't despaired. Somehow I maintain hope in spite of hope, and I've talked about the difficulties and how hard the problems will be as we tackle them. But I want to close by saying this afternoon that I still have faith in the future, and I still believe that these problems can be solved. And so I will not join anyone who will say that we still can't develop a coalition of conscience. I realize and understand the discontent and the agony and the disappointment and even the bitterness of those who feel that whites in America cannot be trusted. And I would be the first to say that there are all too many who are still guided by the racist ethos. But I am still convinced that there are still many white persons of goodwill, and I'm happy to say that I see them every day in the student generation, who cherish democratic principles and justice above principle, and who will stick with the cause of justice and the cause of civil rights and the cause of peace throughout the days ahead. And so I refuse to despair. I think we are going to achieve our freedom, because however much America strays away from the ideals of justice, the goal of America is freedom. Abused and scorned though we may be, our destiny is tied up in the destiny of America. Before the Pilgrim Fathers landed at Plymouth, we were here. Before Jefferson etched across the pages of history the majestic words of the Declaration of Independence, we were here. Before the beautiful words of the Star-Spangled Banner were written, we were here. And for more than 2 centuries, our forebears labored here without wages. They made cotton king. They built the homes of their masters in the midst of the most humiliating and oppressive conditions. And yet out of a bottomless vitality, they continue to grow and develop. And I say that if the inexpressible cruelties of slavery couldn't stop us, the opposition that we now face, including the so-called white backlash, will surely fail. We're going to win our freedom, because both the sacred health of our nation and the eternal will of the Almighty God are embodied in our echoing demands. And so I can still sing, we shall overcome. We shall overcome because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. We shall overcome because Carlyle is right. No lie can live forever. We shall overcome because William Cullen Bryant is right. Truth crushed earth will rise again. We shall overcome because James Russell Lowell is right. Truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne. Yet that scaffold sways the future. With faith, we will be able to hew out of the mounting of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to speed up the day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and live together as brothers and sisters all over this great nation. That will be a great day. That will be a great tomorrow. In the word, to speak symbolically, that will be the day when the morning stars will sing together and the sons of God will shout for joy. Thank you.